So this week I'm going to cover three themes. So corruption, following the state, and nationalism. So let's get into it. Let's start with corruption. This week, Trump's annual financial disclosure was released. In 2025, so the first year of his second term, Trump made more than $2 billion. The largest single source of this was cryptocurrency, which was about $1.5 billion, including $635 million from Trump's meme coin. Yahoo reported this week that nearly 1 million investors in the meme coin have lost almost $4 billion on their investments. Trump says he doesn't talk to the people managing his money. But the disclosure also revealed that on the 8th of April 2025, so after markets had been falling for 4 days following his sweeping Liberation Day tariffs, accounts linked to Trump made 327 stock purchases. The very next morning, Trump posted on Truth Social, "This is a great time to buy." 4 hours later, Trump announced a 90-day pause on the tariffs, following which the stock market jumped nearly 10%, recovering around $4 trillion in value. This week, Trump also took his first flight on his new Air Force One. So this is a Boeing 747 that was gifted to the US by the Qatari government, worth about $400 million. On top of that, the US Air Force has also spent another $400 million retrofitting it to meet the security requirements. And apparently part of that cost was drawn from funds originally allocated to the nuclear missile modernization program. The plane will serve as Air Force One until Trump leaves office. But then it's apparently going to be transferred to his Presidential Library Foundation, which basically means that it could then be used as a private plane for Trump. Now, multiple legal experts say that this arrangement likely violates the emoluments clause, basically saying that presidents shouldn't profit off the presidency. It's also worth noting that Qatar is somewhere where the Trump organization has invested over $5 billion in a golf resort, and the Attorney General who approved the transfer at the time, Pam Bondi, previously worked for Qatar. Also in the family, Donald Trump Jr., so Trump's son, is a shareholder and board member of an online gun shop called Grab a Gun, and they call themselves the Amazon of guns. Donald Trump Jr. even rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange when the company went public last year. Now, last week, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, also called the ATF, proposed a new rule that would allow licensed dealers to ship firearms directly to buyers' homes, bypassing the requirement to pick them up in person at a gun shop. Now, gun control groups say that this could be one of the most significant changes to US gun policy in 2 decades. The ATF itself projects that almost half of all gun buyers, about 3 million people a year, would eventually use home delivery if the rule passed. Grab a Gun's CEO said the company is uniquely positioned to capitalize on this potential opportunity. Last week also saw America's 250th anniversary celebrations on July 4th. For this purpose, Congress established a bipartisan commission called America 250 back in 2016 to plan the nation's birthday. The Trump administration tried to take it over last year, but when it couldn't, it set up a rival group called Freedom 250, which it embedded inside the National Park Foundation. And this week, a report by House Democrats, citing confidential sources, alleges that donors who intended to give to the bipartisan America 250 committee were instead given the bank transfer details of Freedom 250, which is where their money went, all without their knowledge. The report says this could constitute wire fraud and charitable solicitation fraud under federal law. The report also alleges that America 250 was promised $100 million of the $150 million Congress allocated for the celebration, so that's the bipartisan committee, but it's received only $25 million. That said, Freedom 250, so Trump's outfit, denies the allegation and calls the report a partisan smear. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Elsewhere in the administration, and this really shows kind of how deeply corruption is kind of embedded throughout now, the FDA, so the Food and Drug Administration, has announced the composition of a new expert panel to review the safety and effectiveness of peptide drugs. So peptide drugs are injectable compounds that have become really popular among athletes and wellness influencers. Health Secretary RFK Jr. has publicly said he is a big fan of peptides. Now, previous FDA panels on peptides have been composed of academics and independent researchers, but the new panel is composed mainly of doctors and pharmacists who prescribe, produce, or promote peptides commercially. So, this pattern is the same as the one we've already seen with vaccine advisory panels, where independent academic experts are being replaced with practitioners who have a stake in the outcome. The next section is going to be about hollowing out the state, hollowing out the administration's ability to do its job. This week, the most significant item is a Supreme Court ruling that shifts the balance of power in ways that could last decades. On the 29th of June this year, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 along ideological lines that Trump had the right to fire Rebecca Slaughter. Now, she was a Democratic commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, but the point is that she was fired without any reason. What this ruling does is it overturns a 1935 Supreme Court precedent called Humphrey's Executor. And so almost 90 years ago now, that established that commissioners of independent agencies could only be fired for cause, so things like misconduct or neglect of duty. So presidents couldn't just fire you for no reason. And that protection was created specifically to insulate these kind of expert regulatory bodies from political interference. The FTC alone, where Rebecca Slaughter was a member, enforces 80 statutes covering almost every part of the economy, from antitrust law to consumer protection. This Supreme Court ruling now affects around 24 independent agencies, any of which can now be packed with political loyalists or purged of career experts at the president's whim. Chief Justice Roberts carved out a possible exemption for the Federal Reserve, but he didn't really resolve that question indefinitely. Justice Sotomayor, who dissented, wrote that the majority had endorsed total executive control and produced a president who emerges with far greater power than ever before. Trump himself celebrated on Truth Social, calling it one of the most important rulings ever given with respect to presidential powers. Then separately, I want to talk about conviction review units. Now, these are units that are there to identify cases where people may have been imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. So they're pretty important in establishing and maintaining justice in the US. But in Minnesota, the state's attorney general has just shut down his office's conviction review unit after the Trump administration suspended its federal funding. And this is kind of coming on the back of several months of dispute between Minnesota and the administration. Kind of more broadly, the New York Times this week reported on what it described as a generational collapse in civil rights enforcement cases across the federal government. So in 2025, Trump issued an executive order instructing agencies to deprioritize civil rights cases. And since then, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Departments of Education, Housing, Justice, and others have closed large numbers of discrimination cases. There's no real public accounting of exactly how many, but legal advocates describe what they call a generational void in enforcement. So what that means is that discrimination law itself hasn't changed, but the capacity and the political will to enforce that law has effectively been removed. The administration has also been undermining states' rights. So the Commerce Department has accused California of environmental terrorism after the state is trying to assert its own rules on energy production, which are more climate friendly, and it has also said that it would evaluate the performance of the California Coastal Commission, which does things like regulate offshore wind farms. And then separately, the Justice Department has filed lawsuits against both Virginia and California over their recently enacted gun restriction laws, arguing that they are unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. On the one hand, you've got an administration that has argued vigorously for states' rights, but basically what it seems is that states' rights are fine as long as they align with Trump's priorities, and when they don't, you get under attack. The last thing I want to talk about is nationalism. And I guess this week the biggest story around that is birthright citizenship. On the 30th of June, the Supreme Court ruled that birthright citizenship, which is the guarantee that anyone born on US soil automatically becomes a US citizen, is protected by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So that ruling basically overruled an executive order Trump signed on his first day in office last year, which would have denied citizenship to children born to parents without legal status or on temporary visas. Every lower court that had considered that question agreed with the Supreme Court that it was unconstitutional. Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote for the majority, was clear. Children born to parents unlawfully or temporarily present in the United States are citizens at birth under the US Constitution. Trump responded to that on Truth Social with a post saying, "The Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship, which is too bad for our country, but we can easily make it up in Congress through legislation." So what Trump wants to do now is pass a law banning birthright citizenship for some people. Constitutional law experts say that's not true, that the only way to change the 14th Amendment is through another constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of both chambers of Congress and 3/4 of states to agree. Ordinary legislation cannot override a constitutional right. Nonetheless, Republican lawmakers are now looking at ways that they can kind of circumvent the Supreme Court's ruling. So one way is to use Congress's power to deny federal money to agencies or jurisdictions that recognize birthright citizens. And the Department of Justice has also directed federal prosecutors to prioritize investigations of birth tourism. Now, birth tourism is where foreign nationals travel to the US on tourist visas to give birth so that their child becomes a citizen. So it's not that birth tourism doesn't exist. It does exist, but it's a tiny phenomenon. The organization Full Fact estimates that at most it represents 0.5% of annual births in the US. Separately, in the 5 days immediately following the Supreme Court ruling, ICE did a big surge in immigration enforcement and arrested more than 10,000 people. And then finally, I just want to kind of talk about a separate aspect to nationalism, which is about rewriting America's history to match the administration's view of an ethnically white Christian nation founding. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History was the target of a 162-page report published by the White House's Domestic Policy Council. And they published this report on the 4th of July, which I don't think is a coincidence. The report was called Saving America's Story, and it accused the Smithsonian of ideological capture, claiming that it has abandoned its mission to tell America's story in favour of extreme political activism, including anti-white bias and concentrating too much on slavery. The museum's director is named throughout the report, along with several more junior staff members. Now, the Smithsonian has operated more than 180 years as an independent institution. It is internationally respected. And it responded and said it remains committed to non-partisan and independent scholarship. This kind of latest attack follows a March executive order by Trump directing the administration to ensure that federal museums and historic sites reflect American exceptionalism. And it follows a previous threat of cutting the Smithsonian budget unless it handed over its records to the administration. That's it for this week. All of these stories with sources and more are on trumpactiontracker.info. See you in a week or two.